Fantastic. Okay, thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and also a great honor to be introduced by Göran Rosenberg, whom, as he said, I've known for years, and whose work I've always admired, because he's not only a better writer than me, but also a better journalist. But it gives us something to aspire to, which is always good. So I'll speak about the future of the nation, but obviously in order to speak about the future of the nation, one also has to speak a bit about the past and the present of the nation. As early as the 1970s, the American sociologist Daniel Bell, one of the first to write about post-industrial societies, almost avant la lettre, he was very ahead of his time sometimes, he said about the nation that the problem with the nation is that it's too small for some problems and too big for some other problems. Too small to solve the problems facing humanity, I think he must have meant. And today we would have said the problems of inequality, the problems of the environment, the problems of rampant global competitive destructive neoliberalism. One might say today, too small to solve these problems, but too big to solve some other problems. And with this he had in mind the problems of identity, of belonging, because the nation being abstract is somehow too big and too complex for me to feel it as an intimate home. But perhaps, and I'll come back to that later on, perhaps the nation is just right for some things as well. It's too big for some things, too small for other things, and maybe just right for some other things. I'll try in this lecture not to engage in wishful thinking, but instead try to say something about where I believe the nation and the nation state is going, with a special reference to Europe, but perhaps with some asides to other parts of the world. Now, we have some standard narratives. Let me just run through them very quickly. We have some standard narratives in the academic literature on nationalism on the origins and the functioning of the nation, or the nation state, or of nationalism. Nationalism being the ideology of the nation state. Academic research on nationalism really took off only in the 1980s. At a time when many theorists of nationalism believed that it was on the wane, it had somehow reached its pivotal zenith and was on its way down. Many believe that. Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist historian, famously wrote in his book Nations and Nationalism since 1780 that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, referring to Hegel. The owl of Minerva, wisdom, flies at dusk. In other words, only when a phenomenon is on its way to disappearing can we see it clearly. And by this he referred to nationalism. Ernest Gellner, whose name is always mentioned in discussions about nationalism, associates the growth of nationalism with industrial society. Ernest Gellner was an anthropologist and a philosopher and a functionalist. So he saw the ideology of nationalism as the organic, necessary ideology of cohesion for industrial society. And the logic is very simple. I mean, let me put it in my own words, okay? He would have said it slightly differently. The logic is very simple. In a small community, in the Gemeinschaft of pre-industrial society, you have an attachment to the land, to your homestead, to your parents, to your childhood experiences, and you feel somehow very close to them. And if you're an African, you even have a direct connection with your ancestors because they're buried in your village, and their spirits somehow live on in your village. So you have that very close, direct, organic connection to place, and an identity, and it's also a source of solidarity. And then comes industrialism, and it whisks you away from your village into the big city where you meet strangers, and you're far away from the place of your childhood, your parents, etc., and all the smells and sights and everything that's familiar. You become alienated in the big city. Big problem. Then comes along nationalism and says, don't worry, my young man, as it usually was, eventually young woman as well. Don't worry, my young man, you believe that all has been lost, but in fact all has been saved because you have a new family and a new home and a new set of childhood memories, only that they have been lifted up to another level. So from now on, your mother and father, your brothers and sisters are the nation, and your home, the place to which you attach your childhood memories, is no longer just a silly old village. It's a Norwegian village, so you belong to the grand abstract community of Norway. A functional ideology of integration in order to create solidarity among these newly industrialized peoples. Benedict Anderson, whose name is also always mentioned in accounts of nationalism, publishing his book in the same year as Gellner's, Nations and Nationalism by Ernest Gellner, 1983, Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, also 1983. Although Imagined Communities has been published in a couple of revised editions later on. So this was a miraculous year for nationalism studies. In fact, there was a third book as well, which was rather good, called The Invention of Tradition, edited by Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger. Also about the attempts to make nations seem much older than they are. And there was a scandalous chapter in that book by Hugh Trevor Roper on the Scottish Highland tradition. You know, on the kilt and I mean, all of this was pretending to be ancient, but in fact quite modern inventions, but invented in a very conscious way in order to appear to be ancient, just like the Norwegian folk dresses, the bunads invented in the early 20th century, giving off the appearance of being extremely ancient. But in Anderson's book, if in Gellner's book there's one main character, that's industrialism, the Industrial Revolution, which created nations. In Anderson's book there's also a main character, which is what he calls print capitalism. You know, the invention of the printing press and the way in which all kinds of publications, pamphlets, newspapers, books, magazines, which spread across a wide territory, contributed to the standardization of languages. I mean, dialect variations became much less, and also to the standardizations of people's representations and identities, because people were exposed to the same ideas, whether they were in Munich or in Hamburg, following at least in theory, they could be. So the standardization of languages and the standardization of people's representations. And the book in Anderson's account also enables people to imagine themselves as members of abstract communities. So he places a special emphasis, in fact, on the novel, the realistic novel of the 19th century, as a means of creating this sense of identification. You sit in your living room and you read a novel in the awareness that someone else, whom you will never meet, sits in another city or in another part of your own city, reading the same book about places and peoples with whom you can identify because they resemble people and places you've met and seen before, creating a feeling of what the anthropologist Michael Hersfeld has spoken of as cultural intimacy. So Anderson, print capitalism, Gellner, industrialism, and with Anderson, the title of his book is a bit unfortunate, Imagined Communities, because the word imagined somehow sounds a bit like imaginary, okay? So in other words, it's just imaginary. It doesn't exist. It's something you just imagine. And to this he has objected that no, it's not imaginary, but the fact is that in order for the nation to exist, you have to use your imagination, because you can't observe it directly. And I once said to Benedict Anderson that, you know, Ben, I mean, you shouldn't have called your book Imagined Communities because it's being misunderstood all the time. Why didn't you call it Abstract Communities instead? Because that's really what it's about. And then he sort of patted me on the back and said, but my dear fellow, who would then buy the book? And you have to agree, Imagined Community is a beautiful, evocative title, but it's also prone to being misunderstood. That's why I'm emphasizing that imagined is not imaginary. But it's abstract. It's something you have to use your imagination for it to exist. And it's a conjuring act, which is quite impressive when you think about it. The way in which members of a successful nation identify quite deeply and quite strongly with people they have never met and will never meet. Whereas in traditional societies, loyalty was mainly based either on face-to-face interaction or to stories about people you knew who were. You knew who the people were to whom you pledged loyalty. Nowadays, we don't really know who they are. We only know them as generic members of our own nation. Later on, I mean, there have been many embellishments of these theories. Okay, I now mentioned Anderson, Gellner. I also briefly mentioned Eric Hobsbawm. And I'm coming back to Hobsbawm in a little while, but I'll just mention a rather nice embellishment of the theory of nationalism by, of all things, a social psychologist and they're called Michael Billig. And the book I have in mind, published in 1995, was called Banal Nationalism. Banal Nationalism. And it's really a book about the unwaved flag. Okay? Maybe this is Sweden, as opposed to Norway. You know, in Norway, we wave the flag all the time, huh? Look at us, we've got the nation. Whereas in Sweden, everybody knows we've got the nation. We don't have to wave the flag, but we know it's there. You know? But he speaks about the power of the unwaved flag. That which the moment you can take the nation for granted, it's secure, it's safe, and it's embodied in a way which it isn't when you have to externalize it through. Look at me, I've got the nation, I'm waving my flag. So you see, it's a subtle point. But Billig also shows the ways in which national identity is somehow it's imbibed subconsciously through many little daily rituals, such as the weather forecast on TV, for example. I mean, every day, you know, people sat down. They used to sit down when we just had one channel. Or in this case, two, okay? They sat down at the same time, watching the evening news. After the evening news, you have the weather forecast. And in Sweden, you would presumably learn everything about the, you know, the temperature and the rainfall in Gothenburg and in Malmö and in Luleå and in Kiruna and Haparanda, okay? But you wouldn't necessarily hear much about the weather in Helsinki or Oslo. And at least in Norway, the case was that there was a massive emphasis, and they took ages, you know, to run through the weather forecast for Norway. So you got this graphic image of the Norwegian map and names of all the towns, and you got accustomed to, unconsciously, of being part of that imagined community and not another. So this is one story of nationalism and the way in which it came about. Now to some of the problems of nationalism. And these are all too familiar today. Some of them have been familiar all along. I'm saying that they're all too familiar today because much of the pressure on nationalism and national identities today comes from the forces of globalization. It is to say, migration, mobility, travel, instantaneous, deterritorialized communication. Okay, through the internet and so on and so forth. Whereas before this latest installment in the history of globalization, which started around, I would say, roughly around 1990, okay, there were also obvious challenges to the nation. And the theorists of nationalism saw this. You know, Ernest Gellner wrote about entropy-resistant groups. His notion of nationalism, he uses these terms in a slightly sort of inaccurate way, but never mind that. His notion of nationalism is that it entails social entropy. And social entropy is it's not really social. I think it means cultural entropy. That people become more similar, you know, that differences are being eradicated. People become more similar culturally owing to the forces of nationalism. His view was that nations do not lie there asleep, waiting to be awoken by some nationalist force. They are created where they formerly did not exist. He has a fairly cynical view of nationalism. By this, it doesn't mean that human communities don't necessarily exist, only that communities can take different forms, and that nationalism was a form tailored to suit the needs of the industrial state. When he speaks of entropy-resistant groups, he means those which cannot be assimilated. And he has this fictitious example from the new state of Ruritania. Ruritania, which just had a victorious war of independence from the great empire of Megalomania. I mean, I think this is really, it's Czechoslovakia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, he's talking about. He was born in Prague. So Ruritania has finally become independent. But there is a minority in Ruritania, and I think he has Roma gypsies in mind, okay? But he doesn't say so. He says the blue people, and the blue people live in the hills. They have a different way of life. They speak a different language, and they don't want to become Ruritanians. And the Ruritanians don't want them either. So what do you do with them? Well, there are a number of options. I mean, you can keep them in place where they are, segregation. You can force them to become Ruritanians. You can move them into the cities and cut their hair and give them a job in the factory and teach them the language. And within a generation or two, they will forget that they've ever been blue people and will see themselves as Ruritanians, assimilation. Or you can exterminate them, you can kill them, which has been more common probably. Ethnic cleansing has probably been more common in the history of humanity than we're willing to admit. So you have a few options. Or the blue people can themselves develop an independence movement, claiming the independent state of the blue people. We've seen this also, and in a not too distant past. So there are several options there as to what to do with these minorities. So in other words, what I'm talking about here is that virtually all nations have a map territory problem. They have a map territory problem. The map doesn't correspond with the territory. The map says that within these political boundaries, people share the same culture, whatever that means. And I want to ask Göran Rosenberg about that. I mean, you have to ask people, sometimes, because they're not making themselves entirely clear always. I was asking, what do you mean when you say on the first page of your book, Nations and Nationalism, that nationalism is essentially a political doctrine which holds that the political boundaries should be coterminous with the cultural boundaries? It's all clear until the word cultural, because what does it mean that people have the same culture? And he shrugged and said, well, I guess I meant ethnic groups. In other words, that a nation is an ethnic nation. He also said other things in other writings, but that is one interpretation of cultural equality. But I think that is exactly one of the questions we need to raise relating to nations today. Does having shared culture necessarily mean having the same ethnic identity? I don't think so. I mean, I know people who have foreign parents and who have a different religion, but who share the same culture as me. In terms of language, we laugh at the same jokes, we read the same books, and we're interested in the same theories of nationalism. And we live in the same city. Whereas some of my neighbors who vote for the wrong party and who have an awful taste in interior decorating and who raise their children in the wrong way, do I have the same culture as them? It's not an easy question to answer. So I think to be charitable to Gelner, we should say that the ideology, the idea of a shared culture and a shared identity, a sense of being we, which is a crucial question in all social philosophy and the underlying question in much social science. What is the meaning of the word we? Which is a question I'm going to bring along when I start to talk about the nation in the near or even slightly distant future. What is the meaning of the word we? What does it entail to be a member of the nation? And what does it mean to have the same culture? Well, we've already seen now very briefly that, yes, even in Gelner's original formulation, there were minorities which couldn't be assimilated into the nation, which didn't fit in. In Benedict Anderson's work, we don't see this in his book so much. He's concerned with the way in which this powerful symbolism of nationalism somehow hits people in the heart. It strikes you in the heart. And he says in the famous formulation in the first chapter of Imagined Communities that nationalism is more powerful than ideologies such as liberalism and socialism because it is more similar to phenomena such as kinship and religion. It resembles kinship and religion more than it resembles ideologies such as liberalism and socialism. In other words, nationalism is emotional. And it's like a form of kinship or religion. So he's concerned with this in that book. But in a later writing, an essay called Long Distance Nationalism, Anderson also shows that, there are some things that don't fit quite in here. And long distance nationalism is about the contemporary tendency among certain migrant groups, certain diasporic groups overseas, to engage in politics in their own homeland, in their old homeland. Not where they live, but where they used to live, or where their parents used to live. And Anderson makes it clear that he thinks this is a terribly bad idea, to engage in politics where you don't live, because you don't have to take the consequences of your political decisions. The way in which the IRA for years was funded by nostalgic Irish Americans, for example. And he even has an interview in his essay, Long Distance Nationalism, with a Canadian Sikh. A Sikh who lives in Canada. This would have been early 1980s, before the assassination of Indira Gandhi, who is involved in the Punjabi independence movement in India. And this Sikh is being asked, if you're so engaged in the independence struggle for Khalistan in the Punjab in India, why don't you go there and join the struggle? He lives in Toronto, okay? And then he said, no, it would be far too dangerous for my children to grow up there. And then he sent thousands of dollars for them to buy weapons. So that's Anderson's point, that to him, Anderson may actually be a classic nationalist in the sense that he feels that you should engage in politics and take responsibility for the place where you live. So, but that is an issue, you know, long-distance nationalism, diasporic groups, divided loyalties, people who don't seem to fit in. That's another aspect of the map territory problem that I mentioned. And that has been, I mean, it was described even before the map territory problem of nationalism. And I'll just mention in a footnote, this is a footnote, okay, a very short footnote, a book by Tom Nairn from 1977 called The Breakup of Britain, where Tom Nairn predicts the breakup of Britain. And it nearly came true last year, or earlier this year. Nearly came true earlier this year with the Scottish referendum. And his perspective from 1977 is that Britain consists of 4 historical nations: the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, and the English. And without empire to hold them together, why should they stay together? There's no reason for them to. So he predicts the break of Britain into 4 constituent parts. And had he written the book 20 years later, he would surely have added the very substantial diasporic groups from the empire. I mean, Indians, Pakistanis, West Africans, people from the Caribbean, and so on, who don't necessarily identify with Britain. As the poet Lyndon Kwesi Johnson put it, there ain't no black in the Union Jack. Later repeated in a book by, I almost said David Gilmour, by Paul Gilroy. Yeah. There ain't no black in the Union Jack. So in other words, contestations around the boundaries of the nation, who is inside, who's outside, a map territory problem, where there are certain people inside the nation who somehow don't fit in and somehow don't identify with the nation. And either they're indifferent, or they want out, or they want to be somewhere else, on the one hand. And there's also another map territory problem. And there's another footnote, because it's not really an important argument, but it just illustrates what I'm saying about the map and territory in nations. That Sweden, like Norway, lost a very substantial proportion of its population in the mid to late 19th century due to migration overseas, mainly to North America. So if you were to trace down all the Swedish Americans, or people who identify as Swedish Americans in the United States, you'd probably find that there were about as many, or perhaps more, than there are Swedes living in Sweden. I mean, in the case of Norway, there would be between 7 and 8 million Americans who identify as Norwegians, whatever that means. They may also identify as something else. I don't know how endogamous they've been, if Norwegians have only married other Norwegians. I'm not sure about that. But the point is that if you want to be serious about the nation, you'll come up against these issues all the time. That the nation is fuzzy at the edges, there are anomalies, there are groups and people who somehow don't fit in, if you have a definition of the nation as consisting of people of the same kind. And this problem has been around for a long time. These problems have been around for a long time. Now, there were some... Oh, yeah. Hi. I was looking at the clock, actually. But now I see you too, Fredrik. Nice to see you. I was just worrying that I was going to say after this short introduction the lecture begins. But I cannot say that now. So let's move on very quickly. The ideas about the demise of the nation were very popular in the 1990s. Lots of people thought that the nation was just about to end. One main reason being that it was too small. Europe was bigger. For example, hereabouts. Europe was bigger, and another reason being that it was too big. Because for the Pakistanis in eastern Oslo, you know, the Norwegian nation really didn't fit their needs. They wanted their own community. They didn't want to be part of this really white and mountainous and sort of full of fjords and reindeer place. They just wanted their flat in eastern Oslo and a family network and the possibility to send money to their family back in Pakistan. So in other words, the nation was just too big and too small. And in addition, keep in mind that the 1990s was a decade of satellite TV and internet, when that really came into the world in a big way. And if we were to follow Benedict Anderson, okay, if it is the case that print capitalism and national public spheres with newspapers and radio and magazines and books create national identities, what then would multi-channel TV and the internet create? Well, probably something far more fragmented. People would no longer watch the same TV programs, so they wouldn't know what to talk about over lunch. Or you might discover that you watch the same TV program as some bloke in California, so maybe you can email with him instead. instead of talking to your ignorant fellow workers over lunch. So there were these ideas went around that in fact, the new information technology would weaken the nation substantially, as would migration weaken the nation substantially, because you would get increasing numbers of people who were betwixt and between, who did not have an obvious relationship to the nation, but who were transnational in their orientation. Plus, there was the economic explanation, which was Eric Hobsbawm's main argument as a Marxist historian. In his book from the late 1980s that I mentioned, that the nation was on its way to oblivion because the world economy was now driven to a great extent by transnational companies and not by nation states. So in other words, the fact of the economy becoming more and more separated from and divorced from the nation state would entail that the nationalism would no longer have the strength to endure, because there was an economic determinism involved. And there was another economic determinism involved by non-Marxists, by the globalists. There was, for example, one very influential in the 1990s. Some of you might remember him, and he still writes, I believe, called Kishore Mahbubani, a kind of business analyst who also wrote about globalization, rather popular, who believed, and he was not a Marxist, but he also believed that there were economic driving forces that would eventually weaken and make the nation disappear. And of course then, finally, there were federalists, people who believed in the federal model. Timothy Garton Ash was perhaps the most prominent at the time, at least I saw him very much as a federalist in the 1990s, who believed in the nested identity model, that you could have many identities. You didn't have to have this umbilical cord that sort of tied you to the nation state. I should confess that, as for myself, I had a lot of sympathy for all of these arguments in the 1990s, and believed that the nation state and nationalism were seriously weakened. Not that they would go away entirely, but that national identity would increasingly have to share the arena, would have to share the stage with lots of other identities, which might or might not become just as important or even more important in this more turbulent, connected, globalized world. And a favorite example of mine at the time was that, and I could use it even today, why not, is that in the city of Barcelona, well, now Catalonia may actually become a separate country. You see where things are going. But at the time, in the city of Barcelona, you could easily see 4 flags next to each other on separate flagpoles. The city of Barcelona, Catalonia, Spain, and Europe. And if you had a 5th flagpole, I'm sure you could have had the UN flag there as well. And for citizens of Barcelona, this did not pose a problem. There was no contradiction. You could have these separate identities. So these were the arguments in favor of the demise of the nation state. The 1990s, I think we can now safely say, was a period of a very upbeat, optimistic form of globalization. When globalization meant the opening up, the tearing down of walls, the Berlin Wall, heralding the beginning of that decade. The end of apartheid, the end of Soviet communism, the coming of the new mobile phones, which made us available no matter where we were, so we could ring up people and be bothered by people at any time of the day, on any continent. The coming of the internet, enabling instantaneous, global, deterritorialized communication at any time. That was the 1990s. And globalization as signifying something exciting, the possibility of getting new impulses, of traveling to exciting places, of making money by selling your stuff to people you've never seen before, and so on. The decade of Bill Clinton. Then came 9/11. And I think that date, the terrorist attack on the United States, is significant if we are to think about the present state of the debate over the nation and possibly its future. Not that it in itself changed history, but that it somehow with the hindsight of nearly 15 years, it marks a watershed in contemporary history, in the sense that, if I can put it briefly, and I think I must, we moved from the upbeat, optimistic view of globalization, where internet was the main metaphor for talking about global connectedness, to the paranoid, fear-driven, anxious stage of globalization, where international terrorism and the spread of insidious and destructive and dangerous and violent and hateful ideas and ideologies became a metaphor for globalization. Just after the 9/11 attacks, we had several global, grossly inflated fears connected to epidemics. Remember that? I mean, you had first you had anthrax, and then, which wasn't really an epidemic, but it was another fear, another invisible threat, owing to too easy access, as it were. You get it in your mailbox, you open the envelope, and you die. But then SARS, bird flu, there were several of these, swine flu, several of these epidemics, which never really came to much. And even Ebola, which has been confined to Western Central Africa. There was a fear that Ebola would spread epidemically and kill hundreds of millions. Same figure as the idea of the spread of terrorist ideas and terrorist attacks. So this was, I think that was the legacy of 9/11 to some extent. And it still lives with us, the paranoid phase of globalization. And what does paranoia and fear lead to in populations? Well, certainly not more openness and more celebration of mixing and hybridity, but rather withdrawal, anxiety, and conservatism. So that has been one reaction to this shift in the spirit of the age that we saw very early in this century, when we went straight, more or less, from the decade of Bill Clinton to the decade of George Bush II. So, but I have a couple of other things to say, but I'll make it brief, okay? So, in other words, there has been a tendency of withdrawal. There's less enthusiasm, okay? There's less, for a variety of reasons, less enthusiasm around these ideas of cosmopolitan global identities, divided loyalties, multiple identities, flow, the concept of flow, which was positively marked in the 90s, became less positively marked in the 2000s. And when the great sociologist and social theorist Zygmunt Bauman wrote in 1996 that if the 20th century project of identity consisted in creating stable national identities, then the 21st century project of identity must consist in avoiding fixation and keeping the options open. I think he then somehow, he's really very good at somehow encapsulating complex ideas in simple sentences. And I think this epitomizes a certain spirit that was predominant among intellectuals in the 1990s, keeping the options open and avoiding fixation. Whereas what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen, as I said, the growth of anxiety, the growth of withdrawal, and the growth of ideological polarization around the nation. And that's probably what we're going to see in the years to come. Not that the nation will go away, and I'll try to justify that very soon. Why will the nation hang on? Why will it cling on in the 21st century as it did in the 20th? The nation as an idea, and the nation state as an institution. When many say that it's totally inadequate, and Daniel Bill is still right, the nation state is completely inadequate when it comes to solving the pressing issues facing humanity, such as climate, inequality, migration crisis, and war and peace. The nation is completely inadequate. It's too small to solve these problems, and yet it's hanging on. And competition between nation states is actually also quite destructive in many ways, economically and in terms of human well-being globally. And yet it hangs on. And why is that? And I'm coming to that very soon. I think I should. I see Göran is getting a bit restless. Don't worry. The situation we are facing, and which will continue, not only here, but we also see it in various guises in the United States and in South America and in India, which has recently elected a rather dangerous Hindu nationalist to office. The competition between two rivaling concepts of the nation, one being mainly ethnic or cultural or religious, is us versus them, and the other being based on place and citizenship and inclusion. These are going to be the main ideological conflicts in the years to come. And they supersede and to some extent replace the old conflict or the old contradictions between left and right in politics over identity. Cosmopolitan, place-based, republican as it were, citizenship-based identity, or cultural or religious or racial or ethnic identity. This in turn will lead to a situation in Europe and elsewhere where it is no longer the case that the person is automatically a member of the nation by being a citizen. We get a kind of a segmented form of citizenship where there are degrees of inclusion and exclusion. We will see increasing numbers of people, most of the minorities, but not exclusively, who are only partly members of the nation. Like the people we have done fieldwork among in Eastern Oslo. Many of them born and bred in Norway, they've never lived anywhere else, but their parents came from Somalia or Eritrea or Pakistan, and they speak of themselves as foreigners. You know, we foreigners, you know. And then suddenly someone from Kosovo says, yeah, well, you know, guys, we Kosovo Albanians are the best of the foreigners. And then everybody else says, why is that? Why are you saying that, you idiots? And they say, well, because we're white. And it's the kind of thing that you don't say among, you know, indecent company in Norway, because we pretend that race doesn't exist for us. Race is something they have in South Africa and in Louisiana, but we don't have it. Well, we do. And the guy from Kosovo knows it. And then they might say, you know, I mean, there's something the Norwegians want us to do in order to get integrated, but they never tell us what it is. And if it's someone I know well, I might say, well, you bloody idiot. I mean, you've lived there all your life and you haven't discovered that you have to start skiing, you know, put on skis. And the Norwegians are going to love you. They're going to forget about your skin color, your religion, the minute you put on your skis. I mean, that's only partly a joke, but you see what I mean. Groups which are only partly integrated, which are sort of in the frontier between us and them, who are neither fully us nor fully them. And this is going to increase. So the struggle to fully participate with full rights in the nation is going to be a major struggle in the 21st century, as are these controversies over inclusion and exclusion, which relate to different concepts of the nation. And why is it that I think the nation still will be with us after Göran and I are gone, and maybe even after our children are gone, and possibly even after our grandchildren are gone? Well, the short answer to this is that the nation state represents a fiscal covenant. There is a contract between the individual and the state that you pay taxes to the state, and you stop at red traffic lights, and you follow the state's rules. But the most important thing is the taxes, direct and indirect taxes. And in return, the state offers you something that you want. And sorry to say, in this day and age, it seems to me that what the state mainly offers Europeans is security, safety, not optimism or hope or a utopian vision for a better future, but safety and security from the looming dangers that are all around us. So this is why this is the main thing. And for the nation to have legitimacy, for it to be able to make people pay those taxes, it has to give something in return, and it needs something to join people together, a glue that creates a sense of community. And this is nationalism. But the good news is that nationalism can take lots of shapes, it can take lots of forms. So when Daniel Bell says that a nation is too small for some things and too big for others, you wonder which nation he has in mind. Is it China, 1.2 billion inhabitants, or is it Dominica, 70,000 inhabitants? Slightly different scale. And when you say that a nation, members of a nation should have the same culture, what do you have in mind? You think about Iceland, which is, I mean, not quite anymore, but fairly homogeneous. Same culture? Yeah, well, they all sort of are descendants of, mainly of Norwegians, but apparently quite a few Irish as well. Or is it a country like Argentina, whose inhabitants came from lots of different European countries? Habsburg Empire, Spain, Wales, and elsewhere. And how do you legitimate the... what kind of ideology of legitimation do you have? Do you have a myth of origin, or do you have a myth of the future? The Americas were founded on myths of the future, which seem to work rather well for many of their populations. So what I'm saying is that the state needs an organic ideology to include its inhabitants to varying degrees. And this ideology can be of many kinds. And it does not have to hark back to the Middle Ages or beyond. I may not have to say this since we're in Sweden. Had I been in Norway, I would have had to belabor that point a little bit more. Don't worry, you can be a fine citizen even if your ancestors were not Vikings. And on that note I end, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thomas, for an eloquent and learned exposition of the theme. I think the questions, though, perhaps remain to some extent unanswered. Please, you can take your... And so I hope we still have some room for discussion. I noted that you say that the function of the state is to raise taxes and to give something back. Well, some people question the ability to raise taxes and the ability to give something back. So we still are facing a new situation. I will now invite up both Lisa Pelling and Peter Aronsson here, and you can flank Thomas. Peter, please have a seat. And I will now give the floor first, or the word first, to Lisa, and then to Peter. And then we'll have a discussion, and then I will, at the end of the session, I will also open up for the floor to intervene. Please, Lisa, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Göran, and thank you, Thomas, for this introduction. Thank you so much, numerous audience. Wow, what a lot of people for this quite abstract topic. But I suppose it is because it is indeed a very timely and very relevant topic at these times when we as Swedes, as Swedish citizens, inhabitants, are trying to reorient ourselves in a very new and a very dynamic situation. I think it is indeed very important to make a distinction between the state and the nation. It is just as you say, every nation has a map territory problem, and every state has a problem with its nations. Sometimes nations are bigger than the territory, sometimes smaller, and it's a very uneasy relationship between the two of them. But I'd like to start my comments with talking a little bit about states, and then I'll come back to nations and the future of nations. I'd like to address just very shortly. I won't take an hour. I will be brief.
Go ahead.
I'm just thinking now, and you raised that in your introduction as well, that we are seeing at these very days a crisis of states, just as we thought that European states had kind of come into a new era where borders between our European Union states were becoming more and more unimportant, more and more fluid. We had an external common border instead of internal borders. We had a common asylum system instead of keeping this, what has been called the bulwark of national sovereignty, namely migration policies that were inherit to each of every state. We created a common asylum policy, at least not immigration policy. It's important to note that the labor migration policy has very much stayed within each of the states. And then we see the total collapse of all this acquis of this European Union development over the past few years, where the external border does not fill its purpose, and where, as you said, Göran, borders are being erected internally. There are some people who are saying that the solution to migration and to the violation of human rights that happens to migrants when they try to cross international borders, looking for safety or looking for just for a better life opportunities or better opportunities for their families, that the solution would be the abolition of borders. Seems like a natural, easy solution. Just to scrap nations and scrap borders, just let people move freely. As attractive as this idea might be, just as unrealistic is it. And it is in a sense because of that also a dangerous idea. To frame your visions about how to create better conditions for migrants as something that is connected to the abolition of all borders leads you wrong, I think. I think any migration policy, any policy to think about how states and indeed nations can deal with the world with higher mobility has to start from the idea that we are stuck with the states. The states will be there, and we need to formulate a policy that helps states not erect borders, but slowly, pragmatically, step by step, try to dismantle whatever walls there are, whatever barriers there are, and to work with that. We all agree that the dismantling of borders, the opening up of legal channels for migration, better opportunities for people to move across borders to fulfill their aspirations, their life dreams, is a good thing for humanitarian reasons. It's a way of respecting every person's human right to development, to fulfill their dreams. But we also know it's a good thing economically. We do know that there are tremendous potential benefits connected to the movement across borders. It's obvious for the migrants. That's why the migrants move, because they move from places where they have bad conditions for using their talents, fulfilling their aspirations, bad conditions for living a life in safety. We also know that the countries that they leave benefit because of the remittances they send back, because of the ideas, values that are transferred back in this long-distance nationalism that you talked about. But we also know that it's a very good thing for receiving countries. They have a tremendous potential gain from migration. But to realize this gain, in my mind, is an issue of redistribution. In my mind, migration and realizing potential benefits of redistribution is fundamentally an issue of redistribution, because we know that the potential gains of migration are often long-term, they're often in the future, but as much as the gains are long-term, we also know that the costs of migration, of a lot of people arriving to a small place in a short period of time, as we experience in our country right now, are entailing some costs, reception system costs. We also know that the community pays some short-term but costs for validating professional experiences, educations that people that move to our country bring with them. We also know that these costs tend to be concentrated. They tend to be concentrated to some neighborhoods, they tend to be concentrated to some schools, they tend to be concentrated to some parts of the labor market. So you need to have a system of redistribution, the enormous potential gains, to pay for the short-term, very concentrated costs. And redistribution, as we all know, at this time of human history happens within the realms of the state. States do this. They collect taxes and then they redistribute taxes. So in my mind, instead of thinking of a world where mobility is made easier, where it is easier to become a migrant, where abuse, where migrant death are minimized, is not a world with weaker states or less states. It might just as well be a world with stronger states, where states are more capable of fulfilling this redistributive duty that I think they need in order to be as open as possible. I think one reason why Sweden comparatively has been more open to migration than many other states in Europe is because we've been confident that we can manage this redistribution. We are able to provide language training, we're able to provide the kind of establishment program needed to fulfill this benefit. But then nationalism, how can we create that kind of internal solidarity, the kind of cohesion needed to create support for the strong state, for this taxation that we are needed to redistribute? And then we come back to nationalism. Now I will finish with that. What is Swedish nationalism at this day? What is nationalism in at times where in the population of people now being at school, it's not 15% who are born abroad. The numbers of people who have foreign origin in the sense of having at least one parent born abroad, it's more than a third of the generations now at school. In this nation, what is it to be a Swede? What is it to belong to a common nationhood? These questions are very relevant and very difficult. I think, and we're all aspiring, I think an important part of looking for our new kind of nationality is to look in terms of a multicultural society. We need much more to move in the direction of Canada, where it's natural for these kids that are born in Canada, but to parents born in some other country, wherever that is, to call themselves new Canadians, instead of calling themselves first-generation immigrant. What is that? You know, they didn't immigrants at all. They never moved. They were born in Sweden. Why can they not be new Swedes or just simply Swedes? This year we published in our think tank a report who looked into the concept of Creole. To me, that catches a lot of my imagination. What if a definition of us could be Creole, the Creolization of identities? And this report is born out of kids grown up in the suburbs of Stockholm, the suburb movement Megafon, and many of you know Pantrarna in Göteborg, where they noticed that in their identity, they were not Swedes because they were not allowed to be Swedes. One part of this was racism. They were not white enough to be considered Swedes. Another one was that they discovered themselves that however nationalist Kurdish they were in their self-perception, and they played allegiance to the Peshmerga, and that's what they were dreaming about, to go back and fight for the Kurdish nations. Once they returned to Kurdistan, they were called the Swede, you know, so the Swedes here visiting. And they realized they were more Swedish than there were Kurds, and where would they fit in? And they decided, well, you know, let's not stop asking ourselves and other people we meet about our roots. Let's talk about our feet. You know, where have we been? What are the experiences we bring with us? Not whatever ethnic boundaries we have. Where have we been? What are the experiences we have? What do we do? What do we do with them? And I think this kind of concept of nationhood, of a nation existing, indeed of Creole identities, a constant mixture of creativity, is maybe the future, maybe not of the nation, but of the future of nations that can build modern, mobility-equipped states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. May I just ask you, because I want to clarify something. You're talking about the redistributive function of the state, and that's only the state that can do that. But does that imply, I didn't get that straight, that the state also needs to control its borders better when it comes, because if you also said that we can't have open borders.
I don't think that for the time being we can have completely open borders, but that is not to say that we cannot have.
We never had completely open borders, but do you want to that the state must reassert its control of its border in order to fulfill its task, the redistribution, the task of effectively doing that?
No, I don't think so, because I think that the potential benefit from people moving into the country are so big that we wouldn't, you know, to have to conceptualize welfare as something that is opposed to openness is wrong, because welfare is probably dependent upon openness. There are
two time perspectives here. Immediately you have to, we see that happening right now. Welfare is taking a beating because we have to take care of so many people. So.
Well, that entirely depends upon the perspective. I've argued elsewhere that you know, to say that we have reached our limits, we have no more capacity, that's a political position. That's not a fact. We have never been this rich. We have a tremendous economic growth. We have almost zero state deficit. We can borrow money for zero rent. To say that we have reached our capacity, well, maybe we have reached the capacity of imagination of our politicians. We definitely have not reached some kind of physical limit of what we could do. And if we have, it's in the very, very short term, but in the long term, I don't think so at all.
We'll come back to that, and I will come back immediately soon, Peter. But
yes,
you wanted,
is it okay if I respond?
Yeah,
a bit
absolutely. Now I wanted to ask you if you wanted to respond.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, thanks very much for your very valuable perspectives. And just to echo what you said just now about there is a ceiling, as it were, to the number of migrants that a country can take. That, of course, there is a ceiling, but it's socially and politically constructed, and it's up to us to decide where that ceiling is really. Of course, everything has its cost, but I remember back in the 1990s, I compared Norway, Sweden, and Finland, which had pretty much the same discourses about migration, and we all had tiny extreme right-wing groups, which are now very large, and in Norway they're in government, but who were against immigrants. But they were at the time quite small, and they were all saying the same things. We've reached a ceiling now, we've had enough, we can't take anymore. We've got to integrate those we already have, and they already create a lot of social problems, and they rape our women, and they take our jobs. And in Finland they had a few hundred. In Norway it was a couple of 100,000. In Sweden it was 500,000 or more. You know, so I mean, and the percentage was also much higher in Sweden. So in other words, the ceiling was defined as being in very different places in those three countries. So that's one thing. But I'd just like to, if I could just comment on just one more thing, and we may return to some of those other issues eventually. I think the notion of cultural creolization is extremely valuable. The idea that culture flows, because it does, and it mixes, and it is enriching when you can get it to work. Not everything can flow equally easily, and sometimes you get friction, sometimes you get sort of these billiard balls banging against each other. If you have mutually exclusive religious systems, for example, but by all means, that is a good model for a cultural nation. And if you think about the English language, why is it that the English language has 10 times as many words as the French in the largest edition of the Oxford Dictionary? Well, it's because English is a creolizing, constantly creolizing language, which sucks up words from all over the place and turns them into English words. So that is but in order to achieve this, it also had to simplify its grammar. Right? So you've got to have a simple cultural grammar in order to be able to assimilate all of these things. And if you have a complex cultural grammar, such as cultural nationalism or Salafi Islam, it's not going to work. So this places demands on everyone. But I'd like to say another thing about creolization, because I've been working in Creole societies myself, and I've also been interested in the application of the term creolization in our own societies. And there are some debates about creolization in the Caribbean, which could shed light on some problems here as well. Because creolization in the Caribbean, in Martinique, it's pitted against negritude. Negritude is identity politics, it's blackness, it's being a Negro, as they said in the 50s. Whereas creolization is about, it doesn't matter where it comes from as long as we can use it. And what the negritude people used to say, like Aimé Césaire, who was a communist and a poet, and one of the original negritude poets, he said that the problem with creolité, with creolization, is that it conceals inequality. It makes it seem as if there's no inequality in society and no exclusion, because we're all part of the same sort of cultural world. So you have to make sure that glorification of cultural diversity and mixing does not come at the expense of looking at class differences and exclusion. So I would say that, you know, the bottom line here regarding incorporation of people and inclusion is not necessarily culture and cultural meaning, but it's mundane stuff such as education, housing and jobs. Right, and I know you agree with this. I just wanted to emphasize that. In fact, if you give people a house, education, and a job, lots of things fall into place. They're much less likely to go to Iraq and fight infidels.
Before I give the floor to Peter, may I just put the same question to you as I put to Lisa, because I sense a sphere of a grey zone here. A nation and a nation-state traditionally has been defined by its borders and its ability to control them. We had that until not long ago, and then we entered into EU and we have Schengen, and we have abandoned control of borders. Do you think the nation in the future has to have some control of its border in order to remain a nation able to raise taxes and provide services? It's for you.
It's for me.
Yes.
Don't. You know, the interesting thing here is that what is at stake now in this turbulent, chaotic situation we have in Europe, when nobody really has a solution, and it drives us to despair because we don't know exactly what to do with the refugee situation from Syria, but also from elsewhere. It's not merely Syria, and we know that it's it's going to continue. People in West Africa have smartphones now. I mean, they're in contact with relatives in Germany and the Netherlands in the way that they weren't only 5 years ago. Is that what is at stake? It seems to be the future of Europe and the future of Schengen and possibly even the euro, but not the future of Sweden, not the future of Norway. But it's about the borders, right? It's about the borders. And all proper national mythologies have some heroes who sacrifice their lives at the border, protecting the integrity of the nation. Right? Even the least bloodthirsty nations have those heroes. You have the gaucho in Argentina, you know, who was sort of, and the cowboy in North America, okay, who conquered new land and killed natives in order to do so. And even in the Norwegian national anthem, which mainly glorifies the natural beauty of Norway, you have the phrase, slik fedrene har kjempet og mødrene har grett, as the fathers have fought and the mothers have wept. In other words, the fathers fought and sacrificed their lives at the boundary. You know, the border guard is a crucial symbol of the nation. So I think possibly that is one thing that the nation cannot afford to relinquish in order to remain a nation. You can have osmotic walls which allow lots of people to seep in through to the cell, but you've got to have those walls in one way or another in order to retain your integrity as a nation.
Peter Aronsson, you have done studies of how narratives are, how the memories of the past are shaping our perception of the present. So, with that,
thank you. I will return briefly to the question of the power of imagination, especially when it is institutionalized in what we have called a cultural constitution. You usually don't hear that term of a cultural constitution. We know what a political constitution is, but we have argued that studying the representation of the nation as it appears in national museums over the world, but mainly in Europe, we can discern how the cultural constitution in different nations is constructed, and also say something about the ability of this imagination to deal with conflicts and contemporary issues. Just to give you one example of the differences is when you enter today to the historical museum in Sweden, in Stockholm, you will see, as in all historical museums, an exemplar of the first people here. You will see Bäckaskogskvinnan in Sweden. In Denmark, you will see Køge from Fyn. It's a woman. But in Sweden, when she was placed there in 1943, she was an example of the purest race in the world. An unblended race being pure from the Stone Age up until today. And today when you enter the National Museum, it starts the story with, this is not a Swede. Sweden did not exist. It's an individual, it's a woman. You can relate to her, you can understand her fear, you can put yourself in dialogue with this individual and know something more about what it means to be human. My first argument is that this is not pure knowledge. It's also an ideology in tune with an individualistic ideology of Sweden, of a rational, non-historical ideology of Sweden. But it differs dramatically from when you go to Copenhagen, to the sister institution, to the National Museum in Copenhagen. You will see a very similar skeleton, and they will tell you that this is the oldest Dane. And it starts, the whole exhibition starts with a yelling stone and it ends with a yelling stone. And this is also a new invention, a fairly new invention. And you can see that these very, very different narratives, shorthand for a narrative of how nationalism is to be understood, is very congenial with the asylum politics in how the majority culture in Denmark and Sweden understand its nationalism. So by studying national museums and how they represent the past, we can also understand how they deal with difference in this case and with nation, and how that prepares the nation to meet the contemporary issues and to deal with future issues. So we have done that study comparing 37 countries. and I will not report on that here. I will just make that comment I will make two more comments from that study, and the first is expanding on the Nordic issue. In many sense, you could as an historian, and I'm an historian from the start, you could talk place for mainly civil war. Starting in the early medieval ages, forming a union, a beautiful idea, it became the starting point for an endless war on dominance in the Nordic countries up until the 18th century. Then there is a renegotiation that is taking place on how we understand the threats, but also the common culture. So the threats are mounting in Europe with Germany and with Russia, which makes us look anew on our fellows in the Nordic nation. And we have a concept of Nordic culture developing. So we have a platform of Nordic culture. We have old Nordisk Oldsagsmuseum. We have the Nordic Museum, but we have new states, more states. So there's a platform that is broader than the nations. And you can see this in many countries all over Europe, but not as successful at many times as in the Nordic countries. By imposing the idea of Nordic culture, one of the effects was that the threshold for solving conflicts with violence became much higher. So, for example, in 1905, there was, of course, a tension that could have broken up in another war, but it didn't. And we have many more examples of that. We have a similar situation in the old Ottoman Empire with Pan-Slavism, for example, in the Balkans. That was also on the basis of a nation building. But that was never successfully culturalized and institutionalized. Tito was too much suppressing all the differences that were too acute to be suppressed. And this is one quality of a cultural constitution. If you have acute controversies and acute conflicts, you must be able to deal with them culturally. And if you are able to do that, you have one more instrument for integration that is not so harsh or rigid as the judicial one, or so explicit as the political one. And here I think culture has an important role to play, not just a negative one as too much culture, too much ethnicity. So my argument is in favor for looking upon many different nationalisms and that they have different values that are possible to evaluate. Not in an absolute mode, because this is a situational issue. They have to work well to be good. But in working properly, they could be the difference between a well-functioning negotiation of changes or civil war.
Thank you so much, Peter. May I inject before I leave the floor or leave to Thomas to answer? You note that the image of the nation, which was also created, the Swedish nation, is also a product of some very strong imaginative work in the 19th century, not the least. And then the evolution of the Nordic idea, which is also not there from the start in that sense. Now, could you, with this perspective, because we are now talking about, again, a moment where we need a new narrative for so many reasons, really drastic changes in the conditions for creating or upholding a society. What, do you see a role for a narrative innovations here? And do you see any of them? I mean, we have been touching upon a few, but that you think that, yeah.
Well, I'm afraid I agree with with the other two here, that I think that a new narrative we need is one that is able to see the what you might call creolization or hybridization in the history also of Sweden. I mean, if we look at one of the symbols of nationalism, right-wing nationalism in Sweden, that is the Great Age of Sweden. What was that, if not an import of Scottish industrialists, French officers, industrial workers from Wallonia, and people from all over the place really making up that kind of strength. And so we have lots of elements in the history that can be retold in other ways. So cultural nationalism does not have to be an ethnic story. And here I think I do disagree a bit, because I do not think that the idea that you have been joking a little bit about, the Swedish non-romantic nationalism, that is that we are the only people who are not nationalistic, really, because we are rational and we make pragmatic solution. That is a nationalism, and it has been a very viable and good nationalism for a while. But now I think some new elements has to be added, because there's too much diversity in the country to be able to uphold that kind of simple idea.
It built, it built on a very strong success story that Sweden was, which made us actually confirm that we were the best and most moral, and etc. etc. We have problems with that right now. One more thing you mentioned, that which I think is the ability to deal with conflict. And you mentioned the word the Ottoman Empire, and we talked about that just before, Thomas and I. It's a much maligned term today, the empire, but we remember that in the Ottoman Empire, and also actually to some extent the Habsburgian Empire, minorities somehow coexisted in a way that nationalism didn't allow them to do. Is there a narrative there? We haven't mentioned Europe even. I mean, the European idea. What the hell? Where did it go? I mean,
I was invited to Balkan by UNESCO to help frame an idea of how to tell a story of your neighbors after war. I mean, you have 15 countries that have been sort of eager to tell a story that these are enemies. We need to kill them. You know, we need to. So how do you live with them afterwards? And what most of the academics who were there, they started out with Hobsbawm. This is a creation. We need to criticize nationalism. But having studied how to deal with conflicts in a long time perspective, I said that is much too early. People have offered their blood. Sons and daughters have offered their blood. I mean, it took some 50, 60 years before you could talk about the Second World War more nuanced in Norway and Denmark. And it's similar in the Balkans. So we started out instead with, what do we have for kind of common memories that are not controversial? So we started out back in the Ottoman Empire and with the culture of cafes and coffees. So we could see that all had that, and they had happy memories of that. And we could then start out from these cafes and the public sphere that grows out of cafes, and get on to science, culture, nationalism, but starting out with a meeting point that is culturally shared and had an essence in the Ottoman Empire. So it was not starting by the big history, but rather with the common sense. And we managed to make that traveling exhibition, and we managed to move to at least a couple of these countries before there were diplomatic controversies between Bulgaria and whoever. But that was our approach, using the empire, but not as a grand story, but as a shared experience.
Yes, thanks a lot, Peter. I think these comparative perspectives are really useful, because one of the things that we need more, perhaps, than for a long time in this part of the world, is some more intellectual and political imagination regarding the kinds of political entities we might envision, and it's very much up to us to create them. And I would like to say that in Sweden, one has tried to do something which has been really progressive, I mean, also in a global perspective, regarding the way in which you see yourself as part of, not merely the history of the nation, but perhaps the history of a broader humanity. I mean, there was a book that you may know, Peter, that was published earlier this year by Peggy Levitt on museums, where she, amongst other things, she compares the Swedish and Danish museums, and she sees some huge contrasts. And the same thing would have happened had she gone to Norway, because in Denmark, she says, the outside world only enters into the picture insofar as it concerns Danes, you know, insofar as it tells something about the Danes. So you learn about the Danish colonies in the Caribbean, for example, because because there were Danes there and so on. Whereas in Sweden, the World Museum in Gothenburg, where she was, which was then quite new when she did her fieldwork, tries to tell the universal story of humanity through people from very different parts of the world in order to help people identify with others than their co-ethnics. So by all means, I think there is something valuable here that needs to be salvaged. Whereas at the same time, if we're going to have nations, I think we are, and I think we are, because we need them. But they shouldn't be allowed to rule the roost on their own. But we're going to need them for our security, for goods, for services, for jobs, for roads and railways, and all the things that nations used to offer us in the past, which are now increasingly been left to the private sector. But we're going to need them. They will need to negotiate the boundary, renegotiate the boundary, and renegotiate the question of diversity versus unity, right? And maybe if I could just throw in something here, maybe in this part of the world, different parts of the world differ. In Uruguay and Argentina, where they have a sort of a Denmark-Sweden relationship, okay? And with Chile as Norway. But they all speak Spanish, they're all Catholics, so they can't use language and religion as markers of identity. And they all mainly came from Europe. I mean, apart from Chile, there aren't very large native populations in any of these countries. So they have to find other symbols, which they can make to work. The tango in Argentina, for example, you know, I mean, they have certain, and they have certain stories, you know, that they tell each other in Uruguay that make them Uruguayan. So, in other words, what are the stories that we need to tell ourselves in order to feel that we are part of the same community? And maybe in this part of the world, to return to what I said, maybe it's language. Maybe Sweden is the language community. And maybe Norway is the language community. And maybe one reason that we feel so close to each other is not that we have a shared history, because that was a history of conflict, you know? Sweden was the enemy, you know, for Denmark, Norway for centuries. And it's not because we have a shared religion, because that kind of religion, I mean, doesn't have the same presence. But possibly it is because we understand each other.
Do we? Do we? Lisa.
Maybe not.
Lisa.
I just wanted to say that I am very optimistic about this country's possibilities to recreate a new kind of sense of what it is to be Sweden, of changing identities. I have a great American friend of mine who remarked when I met him this week that Sweden, if that's his vision of Sweden, I don't know if he's right, but this is what we tell each other often, that we have this need of being in a consensus. We have this urge to homogenize ourselves and be all on the same kind of line all the time. And we were talking about the concept of queer, and he was saying from his perspective it took a long time for Sweden to catch on upon the concept of queer and transgender and whatever. And once we did, bam, everyone in the Pride Parade and 1 million people, all political parties, everyone's queer, whoa. And we have neutral toilets and whatever. Once we get on, all of us are on board. And then he had this, we talked about this concept of racification. And he was saying, when we talk about modern nations, you cannot tell people you can belong because of your background or ethnicity, and other people of other background cannot belong. But it seems to be a barrier to allow people to enter because of your face, because of your looks. There seems to be a border limit there that we just have to abolish. And I think this concept of racification is a very valuable concept. And we were saying it's just a few years we start using this, and it's maybe just months that many of us are using racified as non-white, because for a while we used racified to connotate someone who was colored or black, because we were uneasy to say of the black race or a Negro. We couldn't say, so we said racified, and now we would say racified as non-white. And we would also say racified into a privileged race. And we have made this discussion, and this American friend of mine who happens to be black himself, he said, well, 20 years ago, Lisa, if we had met in SSU as we did at this time, and I were to tell you, you are racified into a privileged race, you would have killed me with arguments of clash consciousness and whatever. And I said, yeah, you're right. So we are moving forward. We're getting more conscious of what it takes to be a truly welcoming, open nation, and what it takes to look in a new way upon what it means that people have different looks but all have the same right of belonging.
But are you talking about the new nation of the new community of the racified? And what about those who are not racified? Are they now excluded from the
No, that's what I'm saying. But I think the insight is we're all racified. You're racified as white. Some other are racified as that the racification that is racification.
I don't want to be racified. I don't want to belong to a nation where I'm racified.
That the it's in the eyes of the one who looks at it.
Joke aside, I want to raise the issue because it has been said that the state is needed to do, and the nation is needed to do many things, so we need it. Although we can see that states, how needed they are, they can fall apart. We see the failing states. The philosopher Richard Rawls once defined justice as a larger loyalty, and he exemplified that actually what we call justice is in the modern nation state just a widening of the loyalty that you previously had to your kin or to your village, your region, or whatever, and we managed to extend that. Can we sustain that level of loyalty that is needed to uphold these institutions of the state that takes a lot of your money and you are supposed to do good things with them? But if you don't trust other people, if you don't trust the state, if you don't trust that this is going to happen, how do we sort of enhance? How do we create loyalty in a situation in which we are now?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and it also sort of takes us back to, I mean, the material foundations really of the state and of nationalism. I mean, nationalism in a sense is just the icing on the cake, and what's below is the state and its institutions and this sort of reciprocity between the citizen and the state. And when you talk about failed states, many of the states that are considered failed were states that never really were nation states. I mean, they never became nation states. Somalia was never a nation state. It was a conglomerate of clans in shifting loyalties and shifting alliances. Iraq was never really a nation. Libya wasn't a nation. It was a patrimonial state run by a state elite, where the citizens were not really citizens, they were subjects, because they didn't have full political rights. So you didn't really have, as long as you kept them fed and you avoided bread riots, you'd be okay, sort of. So failed states were never really well-functioning states. I mean, one thing that struck me once I came to West Africa, I came to Mali, which was considered then a very stable West African country, nice place to visit. And I went out into the street just after to buy a pack of cigarettes, and it cost €1. And I thought, you know, this is not a very well-functioning state, because they're unable to extract indirect taxes from the citizens, and probably nobody even pays income tax. So where they get money from to maintain hospitals, roads, schools, and so on? Probably nowhere. And they dilapidate, everything's run down, and nobody wants to pay taxes because they can see that the state doesn't perform anything for them. So how can we keep that? Just very briefly, Göran, there was an article. Now it's moving back to Europe. Now the states which were never functioning as nation states. Now back to Europe, where we have functioning nation states, which are under pressure, not only from diversity, but also from neoliberalism and privatization, you know, where the state increasingly doesn't really offer the goods that it used to, because if you want good health service, maybe you have to pay a bit extra to get it in a private hospital, increasingly. Even in Scandinavia, this is happening now. There was an article in 2004 by David Goodhart, the then editor of Prospect, whom you also know, called Too Diverse, ? Which was exactly about this. If the country becomes so diverse, and you get a large underclass of ethnic minorities who don't pay a lot of taxes, who are on the dole to some extent, who receive welfare benefits, and the middle classes don't identify with them because they don't know them. For how long is that middle class going to keep up with the taxation levels? I mean, how long are you going to keep up with paying 50% or 60% for income in taxes when you know that money is not going to benefit your children, but the children of people you've never identified with anyway? So there is an issue here. That's why I'm saying that you need to regulate that sort of osmotic barrier, and you need to find a way of getting people into the fold, turning them into yourself.
You're saying that a well-functioning state or nation state can never fail.
No, I'm not saying that.
No, because you said those who had failed were very malfunctioning.
Yeah, so, well, maybe Sweden is too big to fail, you know.
Yeah, Sweden. Okay, that's
it
what
would be so expensive.
Can you imagine an European?
It would be a catastrophe. As an old anarchist, I had to come to that realization sooner or later in my life, that it would be a catastrophe for the way of life that we cherish, sitting in this room, lit by electrical lights, safe and nice and warm, and knowing that we can walk safely out on the street afterwards. It's unimaginable at this level of complexity without the state. for the time being.
Can I just say that I think the culture is more than icing on the cake, and I think the example I took with Yugoslavia is at least one example in the case that was not a dysfunctional state in a, and you can also raise the question because I would not disagree. Of course, it's important that roads work and electricity work, but how it connects with the level of trust and the level of creativity that you can that has a cultural foundation too, and if you cannot then work through important issues in the country, like in Greece, for example, they when we studied the national museums there, they have such a heavy load of classical Greek Hellenism that they never reach any issues of the 20th century. So you cannot see any reworking of that kind of constraints they've been through in the civil war, in the junta, all these kind of atrocities that have been dealt with have never got any public recognition, and that is part of the explanation, I think, that the level of trust and, or the level of distrust rather between civil society and political society is so detrimental. So you can argue that you need both.
But Greece is a great example because I mean, as you were suggesting, yes, I mean it's somehow destructive. I mean, this sort of distrust towards the state, and at the same time, Greeks have an extremely strong national identity. You know, coming to Greece and talking about Greekness, it's almost like coming to Norway and talking about Norwegianness. It almost feels the same. Yet the main difference is that in Norway you don't really distinguish between state and society because we're all sort of the same. Okay, whereas in Greece, to say that state is society, people wouldn't believe their own ears. You know.
No, that's why we talk in a way we talk beyond each other, because I talk about the cultural constitution as the sort of national.
Yes, exactly.
And you're talking about the explicit nationalism that is useless in that sense.
Absolutely.
I will just wrap it up a bit here, and then I will open up. We have managed to spend an hour and a half without really mentioning the problems of Europe and the relation between the resurge of nationalism in Europe and perhaps the failure of Europe to provide a larger narrative for the nation states, which was in the 90s the self-evident thing. Europe was the way in
the logical extension.
Yeah, the logical extension. That didn't happen. Now there is, I think it was Marx said that the historical events or facts or figures repeat themselves twice. First time as tragedy and the second time as a farce. And when it comes to nationalism, we have seen the tragedy in Europe. We were quite aware of it in the Second World War. Is the nationalism we are seeing coming back as a farce? Or what is it? What will happen with these nationalist sentiments, parties, ideologies, some of them clearly xenophobic or whatever? What do you say?
Well, certainly it does not have the progressive role it had in the 19th century in these sort of right-wing nationalist modes that we see. So I think that the challenge is to transform it. The challenge is to show that there are nationalisms that are relevant, and I think that is what we need to do, and that needs new stories that have a degree of hope, a degree of possibility of using the movements over borders to give a new vision of what the nation is in that state of affairs in Europe.
Yeah. And yes, but let me just first, comment a bit on the failed project of Europe, because there was a vision at the time, especially in the early 90s, after the end of the Cold War, with the Maastricht Treaty. There was a really sort of upbeat optimism around the idea of Europe, and you had Habermas talking about Verfassungspatriotismus, you know, constitutional patriotism in Germany, which could be extended to the European. And we got a European flag and the European national anthem, you know, the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and so on. And it somehow stopped. And I think mainly it was because it was a top-down project that was impossible for people in localities to identify with. In Denmark, they had a slogan which was rather good, actually, around the Maastricht referendum, where the Danes, or rather some Danes, said that, you know, I want a country to be European in. it's not as if they didn't want to be European, but they wanted their country as well. They didn't want that to be dissolved into some kind of nondescript, anonymous, top-down, Brussels-driven Europeanness. But that does not mean that Europeanness cannot exist, but probably that it should be constructed elsewhere. Maybe one should start with a local diversity and build from there, instead of starting with the shared symbols invented in Brussels, which would alienate people anyway. Then what I would say, Göran, is that I think as I said during the lecture as well, I think we are now at the beginning of a rather long phase of polarization in European politics, between nativism, between this sort of close boundaries, ethnic histories, keep the foreigners out, pull up the ladder attitude on the one hand, but also keep the welfare state. I mean, this is not just right-wing. It can also be disgruntled social democrats who are worried about diversity and want to save the welfare state. We have quite a few of them back home.
And where is this leading?
It's leading beyond the right-left divide towards
this polarization. Where is this leading?
I think we talk about here two social ontologies in a way. You have the communitarian and you have the liberal. And it's not left and right, really. I mean, you see what I mean. One, like, associate, as you said, roots on the one hand, you have boots on the other, feet, roots, traditions, security, the group, the past, and on the other hand, freedom, mobility, mixing, the individual. And that these are the two main sort of views of what society is about. And we should find a way of striking a balance. For many years, I would never celebrate 17th of May back home because you didn't want to be associated with nationalism. And then you realized, as some Swedes did in the 1990s, that if I don't do it, this symbolism is going to be taken over by right-wing people. So we should reclaim it, reclaim the flag. Lisa?
The European question is so large, Göran, I don't know where to start. I think we shouldn't be too optimistic. Maybe it's this week, because it's a week ago since we scrapped half of the respect for the asylum right in Sweden and made some very dramatic decisions and all of this. Of course, because Sweden, as the last part of the chain, could not.
Did we scrap the respect for the asylum rights?
We didn't. For some people that we used to deem worthy of our protection are no longer worthy of our protection, and we are making it a lot more difficult for people who come here to integrate into our societies.
By controlling our borders.
I know, no, we are giving people 1-year permits and expecting them to integrate into our society, and we are telling people that they should become full members, but we are not allowing them to reunite here with their families. I think it's it made me very pessimistic. I just wanted to say that I think just as with loyalty to the state depends on the state being able to deliver, obviously this is the case also for Europe. The European idea is strong when people see that the European idea can deliver. Now we are still in the midst of a very severe economic crisis, not in Sweden but in other European countries, where clearly the European Union maybe has delivered saving the banks but had not delivered savings of the normal people and their everyday lives and their prospects and their educational systems and their workplaces. And we're also seeing now in the midst of the refugee crisis a European Union being unable to deal with this in a coherent and humanitarian way. And I think, we cannot disconnect the belief in the European ideas and values from what is happening at our borders. Looking a bit beyond the present crisis, now in the midst of this crisis, the European leaders met with the leaders of the African Union. There is such a thing as the African Union, tried to represent the 50-odd states that make up the African continent. And we know that the African continent will double in size towards the first half of this century. We need to deal with migration coming from the African continent, and we're just totally unable to do so. And we will see that the Mediterranean will be a scary place, because we'll have European employers trying to recruit workers from south of the border, and they will not have any legal channels to come. They will come illegally. They will create and feed a smuggling business that will be more and more ruthless. And we cannot teach our kids in our classrooms the values of respect for human life and everyone is equal when that's what they see on the evening news. So I am very worried. Invite me in half a year's time to talk about my visions for Europe. I might be more optimistic, but I'm not now.
Well, I'm sorry to end there, but I think we are. I think I think I said it in the introduction. There is a paradox here, or a gap between nationalist feelings, ideas, parties, xenophobia, whatever you have, closing of borders, on one hand, which you now see in Europe, and the fact that so many of the things that we need to decide for our citizens and their welfare are transnational in character, and we need to find ways to deal with so many issues that are up in the air. But that doesn't mean that we will prevent you from solving the problem. And I saw you were waving up there, so please do we. And here is another one. Do we have a microphone, or do we need that, or?
There's one here.
Yeah, you.
It's here. It's here.
I think it's for the recording, so it's good to have a microphone, because we are filming all this, I think. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks a lot. But one thing I lack is the antidote of nationalism, which would be maybe a global cohesion, global culture, global identity.
Globalism.
And I think we can discuss it on just three levels, for instance. Culture, civil society, NGOs, and old-fashioned taxes. So first, about...
yeah. Okay. Go ahead, but not too long, so we can have long. So we, if there is a, yeah, but go ahead. Go ahead. Just make it brief.
Okay. I'm happy to have a study circle in literature. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when we started, we were this Creole global South theme was very odd in Sweden. Today, it's much more. We have much more Creole literature, and all those books from the global South, they are Creole in the sense of Lisa Pelling's. They are, and then we have so this is something very positive. Then we have the NGOs, which are becoming INGOs, international NGOs. And last, taxes, economic, we have very little, of course. We have movements for Tobin taxes, etc. But at the European level, I think the answer to Göran's query is that the European project was destroyed by a complete lack of being able to get in taxes because of the deficit in social and the deficit of the construction. And I think this should be said, that this project was destroyed by not being able to have common policies, common taxes, at least the lowest taxes, on the one hand. And because you can't, you just get free rein for neoliberalism. I'm sorry to use such a marked word. But you have free rein for neoliberalism, no room to create cohesion with this financial construction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please, here, we will have a few voices, and then we'll... Please, the microphone here. Yes, please. And then the second.
I tried to make my point. I think to be a human being is a very dangerous thing if you do not have a society around you. You need other people. That is absolutely essential. And people have struggled for thousands of years to build societies, civilizations. And they have succeeded in building nations. And this is the highest form of organization so far I know. One of the things I expect from a nation is a defense for its people. The purpose of a nation is to defend its people, the people that has built the nation. And now we have a situation where you, among others, are trying to teach us, the native Swedish people, that we do not exist. We are just the one. We should celebrate the people who came to Gothenburg, the Scotch, the Walloons, all kind of people that have come here to build our nation.
Well, everybody came here once upon a time.
Yes.
Even
yes, but you do not celebrate the people that actually built the place and that actually created this democratic society.
And who were they? Who were they?
This people has its peak around the 50s and 60s, and with the welfare society, with the Folkhemmet. And I think that was a very great thing, trying to build a folkhem.
Do you know how many immigrant laborers participated in the construction?
No. You may pray.
Yeah.
The point is that
okay.
The last 40 years, you are trying to destroy this situation.
Who is trying to destroy?
The ruling classes, I could say, in Sweden.
Okay.
With bringing in legions of people from other civilizations, from failed civilizations, from failed countries, and they are rapidly the feeling of loyalty to this society is falling, and I feel very afraid of people nowadays. And I should say I'm mostly afraid of other Swedish people, and that may sound paradoxical, but you have created the ruling class, the intelligentsia, you know. You have created a split within the people.
Okay, anyone?
Yes.
Right. Thank you so much. Anyone want to comment on this, Thomas?
Perhaps I can comment on both of these interventions, because one of the things that we're seeing in countries today, regarding national cohesion and so on, is creating a moral community. If you think about the 1990s, was a decade of the removal of walls. The early 21st century has been a decade of the Israel-Palestine wall, you have the wall along. But more clearly, you see the emergence in a country like South Africa, where they just left apartheid behind, the re-emergence of walled communities. You have communities of rich people in Johannesburg with high fences and with armed guards, at the gate, who are so scared of their own fellow citizens that they will hardly sort of leave their compound, even to go shopping. Which is clearly a bad sign, for nation building. So that was just, a comment. But yes, we have this polarization. there are competing views, and who should be included. At the same time, as Göran said, people came from somewhere. My ancestry, if I were to trace my ancestry, it would be a bit Swedish.
Okay, please. It's a lady here, next on the second row too.
Thank you for this. It was extremely interesting. It's a question concerning the state and well, I would maybe phrase it like this: how do the state know what it wants? When we look at the refugee crisis now, one can really ask that question: how is the process for a state to know what it wants? One thing is that we have the history, we have something in common, the things that the two guys before me talked about. But we also have the international organizations. A lot of things that we have done is done by being socialized into new norms and values, and we do that together with others. We do it in the international organizations, not just UN, but also many others. We have lots of important legislations in the states that are actually fostered into working by the international organizations. Could you please, Thomas, comment on the role of international organization in where we are now in the different states and what we would like? I think it's vital for the discussion, especially what Lisa talked about with the refugee crisis. Where are they right now? And are they taking any lead in some way of getting states getting together in moving forward into a more open society?
What they do, I mean, but on a general basis, I would say that international organizations, and you also mentioned that, are extremely important in keeping making it a truly global conversation.
Well, now it's obvious in the present crisis that we do have institutions that have a mandate to deal with this kind of situation. We have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who has the mandate not only to receive people into refugee camps, but also has the mandate to work with resettlements. Once refugee camps get too overcrowded, once you cannot secure people housing and food at these places, there is a system that people should be resettled to other countries. That the problem is that both of these things have failed. The UNHCR has not been given enough funds to give people enough food and enough shelter in the refugee camps, and they have not been given enough possibilities to relocate people either. And then we end up with this situation that we have now. So there's a series of events that makes us all look like a failure. And I think what we see here is that the International Organization on Migration, the IOM, that is not part of the UN system, it takes upon itself like a role of being a normative force and saying, when we think about migration in the long term, we need to set up a certain kinds of norms. We need to, for instance, have the principle when we recruit migrant laborers to say the migrants themselves should not pay whatever the recruitment costs, but the employer pays principle, so that migrant laborers are not in debt for their lifetime once they take a job abroad. But we have not managed to incorporate the IOM into the UN system, what we should do if we want them to really be a normative force. I think international organizations are extremely important, only they suffer from the problems of many of these. They're underfunded, they don't have strong enough mandates, and they have a problem with democratic legitimacy. Exactly. They tend to be too far away from us for us to really feel that we can give them enough powers for them to really carry out the tasks we would like them to carry out. And this is a good argument also for this vision of a borderless world. No, I think we need borders because we need to demarcate democratic mandates, and we need politicians to feel they're really responsible for whatever happens within their mandates. Yes, we need a lot of cooperation between states and democratic entities, but I think democratic entities cannot be on the level of the world. World government needs to be. And can I comment upon the gentleman that wants to defend its people? There are two parts of your question. One is, of course, who is the people? What makes someone who's born here more worthy of being the people of Sweden than someone who has put his life savings, all his aspirations, all his talents, all his education, all his dream, his entire family to build a new future here? Why would I, that just by coincidence happened to be born here, might not be loyal to Sweden at all, be more worthy of being defended than someone that really invested his or her entire life in building a new future here? So that's a first. And then what is defending? I think if to defend a modern state, the best thing you can do is to equip this state with the possibility to being as open as possible. No, I don't think it's possible to have entirely free migration. I realize there are borders to what we can receive in the short term and in the long term, but I think we need to create modern, open states, and that's possibly the best way of defending the interest of us living here now.
Thank you. And this young man here, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I didn't really catch your surname, so I hope you won't mind me addressing you as Thomas. You brought up the topic of assimilation, and I've always thought that was a very interesting one. And if I recall correctly, you gave 4 examples of how to deal with a theoretical state. There would be a theoretical group which would be willing to resist assimilation. Could you quickly just restate which of the 4 were, and then I can...
I need to borrow someone else's microphone because I'm not...
I thought. Okay.
It was working. Thanks.
I thought.
I just borrow this for a minute.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Well. Yes. You have enforced. Yep. I mean, you have ethnic cleansing or extermination. That's one. And then you have enforced assimilation, which is another. You know, you force them to become you. And the third is segregation. I mean, you put them. I mean, racial divide policy in America. You know, you don't allow them to become like you, even if they want to. And the 4th option I mentioned, obviously I could have mentioned a 4th one, which is more benign, which is integration, which is somehow finding the balance between being different and being similar, you know, participating in all the institutions of society, but keeping your traditions going in private, that sort of thing. But the 4th I mentioned was actually secessionism, that they give up. They want to found their own state. And what they know is nationalism, therefore they invent their own. Nationalism is contagious.
I think we will have to put an end. We have a little time for mingling and having a coffee outside. And if you have some additional questions, you can do that there. I have to thank all of you for sharing your insights and views. And I think we are all confused on a higher level, as it said. These are immensely difficult issues. And I think all the issues that we are raising in this series are issues where the question is really more important and hopefully will give rise to some imaginative thinking and thought. We need that now. I think I can share that sentiment. We badly need some political and social imagination that really will catch our imagination. That's the trick. We can have zillions of ideas and narratives, but if no one cares, if it doesn't touch the heart of anybody, it won't be worth anything. The thing with nationalism, as it was created in its original, mainly positive sense of being a vehicle for creating democracy, not the least, and individual rights, etc., etc. If that story was a good one in the sense it really caught on, and people still stand there with a flag that really no one knows exactly what it represents today. So that imagination is badly needed and quite rapidly so, I think, looking at where we are going. But with that note, an appeal to imagination, I thank you all very much, and we'll see you out there. Thank you.